Margaret Thorne had been tending her vegetable garden when the purple lights appeared in the sky. At 73 years old, she had seen enough strange things in her lifetime to know that panicking never helped anyone. The lights swooped down like angry wasps, and before she could even reach for her walking stick, strange creatures with blue skin and too many arms grabbed her. The aliens were tall and thin, with faces that looked like someone had stretched putty too far. They spoke in clicking sounds that hurt her ears, but somehow she could understand them through a small device they shoved into her ear. Their leader, who wore shiny metal clothes, looked down at her with what she assumed were eyes. "This specimen will do perfectly," the leader clicked. "Old, weak, defenseless. The Morthaxi will enjoy this meal before we begin our invasion of this pathetic world." Margaret raised one eyebrow. In her 73 years, she had buried 2 husbands, raised 5 children, survived the neighborhood raccoon wars of 2019, and once made a grizzly bear back down from her garbage cans. Being called weak was rather insulting. The alien ship was massive and cold, filled with humming machines and more of the blue creatures. They locked her in a cage that was far too small, clearly designed for someone much shorter. Margaret had to hunch over, which made her back ache something fierce. She listened carefully to their conversations, learning that these Zephyrians had conquered dozens of worlds by feeding their prisoners to something called the Morthaxi before launching their attacks. "The fear energy weakens the planet's defenses," one alien explained to another. "The Morthaxi feeds on terror, and its satisfaction creates a psychic dampener that makes the inhabitants easier to control." Margaret snorted quietly. These creatures had clearly never met a proper grandmother. Fear was something you used to keep children from touching hot stoves, not something that controlled you. The journey took 3 days. Margaret used this time wisely, observing her captors and learning their routines. The aliens were arrogant and careless, assuming she was just another helpless victim. They fed her some kind of gray paste that tasted like cardboard but kept her strong. She pretended to be frightened when they looked her way, whimpering and shaking her hands. This seemed to please them greatly. On the 3rd day, they arrived at what the aliens called the feeding station. It was a massive asteroid that had been hollowed out and turned into a prison complex. Thousands of cages hung from the ceiling, each containing creatures from different worlds. Some looked almost human, others were completely alien, but all showed the same signs of terror and despair. Margaret felt a familiar anger building in her chest. It was the same feeling she got when she saw bullies picking on smaller children, or when politicians made promises they had no intention of keeping. She had spent decades fighting for her family and community, and she was not about to stop now. The Morthaxi's lair was at the center of the asteroid. Margaret could hear it moving even from a distance, something enormous scraping against stone, accompanied by a sound like wind through dead trees. The other prisoners whimpered when they heard it. Some of the aliens seemed nervous, too, despite their confidence. "Take the human to the preparation chamber," ordered the leader. "Clean it and mark it with the feeding sigils. The Morthaxi has been restless lately. This offering should calm it for several months." They dragged Margaret through corridors, lined with the bones of previous victims. The aliens had arranged them into decorative patterns, which Margaret found tacky and wasteful. Her grandmother would have used every bit of those bones for soup stock and garden fertilizer. The preparation chamber was a circular room with symbols carved into the walls. Strange purple light emanated from crystals embedded in the ceiling. 2 smaller aliens, wearing robes instead of metal suits, began chanting in their clicking language, while painting symbols on Margaret's arms with cold, glowing paint. "Do you understand what is happening to you, human?" asked one of the robed aliens. Its voice was softer than the others, almost pitying. "The Morthaxi is ancient beyond your comprehension. It has devoured the champions of 1,000 worlds. It feeds not just on flesh, but on the life force itself. Your terror will make you more delicious." Margaret nodded politely. That's very interesting, dear. Tell me, how long has this creature been kept here? The alien seemed surprised by her calm tone. The Morthaxi has been our ally for over 3,000 years. It was ancient when we found it, sleeping in the void between stars. We built this station around its chosen lair. 3,000 years, Margaret mused. My goodness, it must be terribly lonely. Does it have any friends? Hobbies? When did it last see sunlight? The aliens exchanged confused glances. They had never encountered a feeding victim who asked about their monster's social life. The painting ceremony continued, but Margaret could see she had disturbed their routine. The Morthaxi needs no companionship, the second-robed alien snapped. It is a perfect killing machine. It exists only to feed and grow stronger. Oh, how sad, Margaret said, genuinely meaning it. No wonder it's cranky all the time. I get quite snappy myself when I haven't had proper company for a while. The preparation took 2 hours. By the end, Margaret was covered in glowing symbols that made her skin tingle strangely. The aliens seemed pleased with their work, chattering excitedly about how the markings would enhance the feeding experience. Margaret thanked them politely for their hard work, which confused them even more. They escorted her to the entrance of the Morthaxi's lair, a massive tunnel that descended deep into the asteroid's core. Hot air rushed up from the depths, carrying a smell like sulfur and old bones. Strange red light flickered in the distance, and that terrible scraping sound grew louder. Walk forward, commanded the leader. Do not attempt to flee. There is nowhere to run, and the Morthaxi enjoys the chase. Die with whatever dignity your primitive species can muster. Margaret straightened her back as much as her age allowed and smoothed down her flower-print dress. Thank you for the advice, dear. I'll keep it in mind. She began walking down the tunnel, her sensible shoes clicking against the stone floor. Behind her, the aliens sealed the entrance with a barrier of crackling energy. She was alone with whatever waited in the depths. The tunnel wound downward for what felt like miles. The walls were covered with deep gouges, as if something enormous had clawed its way through solid rock. Strange fungi glowed softly in the darkness, providing just enough light to see. The air grew hotter with each step, and the sulfur smell became almost overwhelming. Margaret paused to rest several times, not because she was afraid, but because 73-year-old knees needed regular breaks. During these stops, she examined the claw marks more closely. They were old, worn smooth by time. Whatever made them had been trapped here for a very long time indeed. The tunnel finally opened into a vast cavern. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, and the floor was covered with the bones of countless victims. At the center of this bone field, coiled around a pillar of black rock, was the Morthaxi. It was beautiful and terrible, like a living mountain made of midnight scales. Its body was easily 300 feet long, covered in spines that gleamed like obsidian. Its head was the size of a small house, with intelligent yellow eyes that fixed on Margaret the moment she entered the cavern. When it moved, the sound was like an avalanche. Another offering, the creature spoke, its voice rumbling through the cavern like distant thunder. How long has it been since the last feeding? Time means little in this place. Margaret looked around the cavern with interest. Oh my, you've certainly made yourself at home down here. Though I have to say, the decorating could use some work. All these bones lying around, it's quite unsanitary. The Morthaxi's head tilted slightly. In 3,000 years of feeding, none of its meals had ever criticized its housekeeping. You are not afraid, it observed. This is unusual. Most creatures scream when they see me. Some faint. A few try to run, though there is nowhere to go. Well, you are quite impressive, Margaret admitted. But I've raised teenagers, dear. It takes more than size and scary noises to frighten me. Though I do have to ask, when did you last have a proper conversation? the way you're talking. It sounds like you've been alone down here for quite some time." The great dragon, for that was clearly what it was despite the alien name, was quiet for a long moment. Its eyes, each larger than Margaret's entire body, studied her carefully. "Conversation?" it repeated slowly, as if tasting an unfamiliar word. "Yes. It has been very long since anyone spoke to me as anything other than a monster to be feared." Margaret nodded sympathetically. "I thought so. You have that look about you. The same expression my late husband got when he spent too much time alone in his workshop. Loneliness does terrible things to a person. Or dragon. Whatever you prefer to be called." "I am Pyraxis," the creature said quietly. "Though the blue ones gave me that other name. I had almost forgotten my true name. Well, it's very nice to meet you. Pyraxis, I'm Margaret Thorne, though most people call me Grandma Maggie. Now then, before we continue, I think we need to have a serious talk about your living situation. This simply won't do." Pyraxis stared at the small human woman who stood fearlessly among the bones of his victims. In 3 millennia, no one had ever expressed concern for his living conditions. The blue creatures who called themselves his allies treated him like a weapon to be aimed at their enemies. The victims they brought him were too terrified to do anything but scream. "You wish to discuss my circumstances?" Pyraxis asked, genuine confusion in his ancient voice. "Are you not afraid that I will devour you?" Margaret looked around the cavern again, taking in the scattered bones, the lack of proper lighting, and the general absence of anything resembling comfort. "Well, you certainly could try," she said practically. "But honestly, dear, you look half-starved and thoroughly miserable. When did you last have a proper meal? And I don't mean those poor terrified creatures they keep sending down here." The dragon's massive head lowered until he could look directly at her. "I consume what is brought to me. The fear enhances the life energy, provides more sustenance than simple flesh." "Nonsense," Margaret said firmly. "You're eating terror and despair, which is like trying to live on nothing but sugar water. No wonder you're so cranky. A proper meal has protein, vegetables, complex carbohydrates. Fear might give you a quick boost, but it can't sustain you properly." Pyraxis had lived for thousands of years, had consumed the champions of dozens of worlds, and had never been lectured about nutrition by his dinner. "I do not understand. You speak as if I am some common beast that requires feeding schedules." "Every living thing requires proper care," Margaret said, settling herself carefully on a large, flat stone. Her knees were bothering her after the long walk, and if she was going to have a proper conversation, she might as well be comfortable. "Tell me, Pyraxis, how did you end up in this arrangement with those blue creatures?" The dragon was quiet for a long time. The question stirred memories he had tried to forget, buried under centuries of anger and hunger. "I was different once," he began slowly. "I traveled between the stars freely, visiting worlds, learning about the countless forms life could take. I was curious about the universe and all its wonders." Margaret nodded encouragingly. "That sounds lovely. What changed?" "The Zephyrians found me sleeping on a dead world, recovering from injuries sustained in a battle with void pirates who were destroying inhabited systems. I was weak, vulnerable. They captured me with their machines and brought me here." Pyraxis's voice grew heavy with old pain. "They told me I could earn my freedom by helping them for just a few years. That was 3,000 years ago." "Oh, you poor thing," Margaret said, and she meant it. "They've been lying to you all this time, haven't they? I realized the truth centuries ago. But by then, the hunger had changed me. The fear I consumed made me aggressive, paranoid. I became the monster they wanted me to be." Pyraxis lowered his great head until it rested on the cavern floor. "I stopped trying to escape, stopped hoping for anything better. It seemed easier to simply exist, to feed when they brought me meals, to sleep between feedings. Margaret felt the familiar anger rising again, the same fury that had driven her to chase drug dealers out of her neighborhood with nothing but a rolling pin and righteous indignation. These aliens had taken an intelligent, curious being and turned him into their pet monster through isolation and manipulation. "Well," she said briskly, "this has gone on quite long enough. How would you feel about getting out of here?" Paraxis raised his head, hope flickering in his ancient eyes before doubt crushed it down. "Escape is impossible. The barriers they've built are powered by the fear I generate. My own emotions strengthen my prison." Margaret mused. "So the more afraid and angry you are, the stronger the barriers become. Rather clever of them, I'll admit. But tell me, what happens if you're not afraid or angry?" "I don't know. It has been so long since I felt anything else." Margaret smiled the same smile she used to use when her grandchildren brought her their seemingly impossible problems. "Then let's find out, shall we? But first, you need a proper meal. All this talk of fear and terror is just masking the fact that you're malnourished." She stood up, brushing dust from her dress, and began examining the cavern more closely. Near one wall, she found what she was looking for, a natural spring bubbling up from deep underground. The water was clean and cold, flowing into a pool before disappearing through cracks in the floor. "Excellent," she said. "Fresh water is essential. Now about food. What did you eat before these blue bullies captured you?" "Star moss from the void gardens of Kelthera," Pyraxis said, watching her with growing fascination. "Crystal fruits from the singing trees of Valdris. Solar plankton from the light streams near Rigel." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "So you're naturally vegetarian. That explains a lot. All this forced carnivory has been making you sick, hasn't it? Aggressive, depressed, unable to think clearly?" "Yes," Pyraxis admitted. "But there are no star moss gardens here, no crystal fruits. Only what the Zephyrians provide." "Dear," Margaret said with the patience of someone who had taught 5 children to solve their own problems, "you're a dragon. A space-traveling, intelligent, magical dragon. Are you really telling me you can't figure out how to grow your own food?" Pyraxis was quiet for several minutes, thinking harder than he had in centuries. Slowly, carefully, he began to remember abilities he had forgotten, knowledge buried under layers of induced despair and artificial hunger. "The mushrooms," he said suddenly, "the glowing fungi in the tunnels. I could encourage them, help them spread. They're not ideal, but they would be better than—" He gestured at the bone field with one massive claw. "That's the spirit," Margaret said approvingly. "And I bet if you look hard enough, you'll find other things growing in here. Caves like this often have all sorts of plant life, just waiting for someone to notice them." Over the next several hours, Margaret watched as Pyraxis began to rediscover himself. He used abilities he hadn't touched in millennia, encouraging the growth of edible fungi, coaxing nutrients from the stone itself, even creating small pockets of pure energy that certain plants could feed on. As he worked, his movements became more graceful, less aggressive. The constant low-level rumble of anger that had filled the cavern for centuries began to fade. His eyes, which had been dull yellow like old brass, began to brighten to a warm gold. "I had forgotten," he said wonderingly, watching tiny silver flowers bloom in response to his touch. "I had forgotten how good it feels to create instead of destroy." Margaret settled herself by the spring to rest her feet in the cool water. "Creation is always more satisfying than destruction, dear. Though sometimes you have to clear away the old to make room for the new." "Is that what you're doing?" Pyraxis asked. "Clearing away the old?" "In a manner of speaking," Margaret admitted. "Those aliens up there think they're so clever, using you as a weapon while keeping you weak and miserable. But they've made some serious miscalculations." "What do you mean?" Margaret's smile turned sharp, and for a moment Paraxis could see the steel beneath the grandmotherly exterior. "They assume all humans are weak and helpless. They think fear is the only weapon that matters, and most importantly, they have no idea what a properly motivated grandmother is capable of." "You have a plan," Pyraxis said. It wasn't a question. "Oh yes," Margaret said. "But first, you need to get your strength back. Real strength, not the artificial power that comes from consuming terror. How long do you think it would take for you to feel like yourself again?" Pyraxis considered this carefully. Already he felt more alert, more alive than he had in centuries. The simple act of growing food instead of waiting to be fed had awakened parts of his mind he thought were lost forever. "A few days, perhaps," he said, "if I continue to eat properly and remember my true nature. But Margaret, even at full strength, I cannot break the barriers. They are designed specifically to contain me." "Who said anything about breaking them?" Margaret asked innocently. "Sometimes the best way out of a trap is to convince your captors to open the door themselves." Before Pyraxis could ask what she meant, the cavern was filled with the harsh sound of alien machinery. The energy barrier at the tunnel entrance flickered and dissolved, and the Zephyrian leader strode into the cavern with a squad of guards. "Morthaxi!" the leader called out in its clicking language. "You have been silent too long. Are you ill? Has the feeding somehow failed to satisfy you?" Margaret scrambled behind a boulder, playing the part of a terrified victim. But she caught Pyraxis's eye and winked before disappearing from view. The dragon looked down at his captors, seeing them clearly for the first time in centuries. They were smaller than he remembered, more fragile. Their weapons, while advanced, were designed to exploit his former emotional state. Most importantly, they were completely unprepared for what he was about to become. "I am not ill," Pyraxis said, his voice carrying new harmonics that made the cavern walls sing softly. "I am remembering." The Zephyrian leader stepped back instinctively. Something was different about their pet monster. The usual aura of barely contained rage was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. Intelligence, purpose, and the growing awareness of just how long he had been used. "Remember what exactly?" the leader demanded, trying to maintain its authoritative tone. Pyraxis smiled, an expression that revealed teeth the size of swords, but somehow managed to look almost gentle. "I remember who I was before you made me into what you needed. And I remember that I was never actually trapped here. I was just convinced that I was." The energy barriers that had contained him for 3 millennia suddenly seemed less solid, more like suggestions than absolute boundaries. And in the shadows behind the boulder, Margaret Thorne began to smile her most dangerous smile, the one she reserved for bullies who thought they were safe from consequences. The Zephyrian leader's confidence cracked like thin ice. "Impossible. You are contained by quantum-locked barriers powered by your own emotional resonance. The stronger your negative emotions, the more secure your prison becomes." "Yes," Pyraxis said thoughtfully, his massive form shifting as he rose to his full height. "That was quite clever of you, but you see, you've made a fundamental error in your understanding of both dragons and humans." Margaret stepped out from behind her boulder, no longer bothering to look frightened. "They assume fear is the only powerful emotion," she said conversationally. "These creatures have spent so long using terror as a tool. They've forgotten about things like righteous anger, protective instincts, and good old-fashioned spite." The Zephyrian guards raised their weapons, energy crackling along the barrel of each rifle. But their leader held up a hand, suddenly very interested in what the human was saying. "You think you understand something we do not?" The leader clicked dismissively. You are a primitive creature from a backwater world. What could you possibly know about quantum containment fields? Margaret chuckled, the sound echoing strangely in the vast cavern. Oh, I don't know the first thing about your fancy technology, dear. But I know quite a lot about bullies, and I've spent 73 years learning how to deal with them. She walked over to where Paraxis had been growing his garden of silver flowers and strange glowing mushrooms. As she moved, the painted symbols on her arms began to pulse with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. You see, she continued, you made several assumptions when you grabbed me from my garden. First, you assumed I was helpless because I'm old and human. Second, you assumed your pet dragon here would simply eat me and get stronger. And third, you assumed those pretty symbols your priests painted on me were just to make me more tasty. The Zephyrian leader's eyes widened as he began to understand. The feeding sigils. They were designed to channel fear energy. But I'm not afraid, Margaret said simply. Haven't been since the moment I got down here and realized what you've done to this poor creature. Do you have any idea what those symbols do when they're powered by maternal rage instead of terror? The markings on Margaret's skin blazed brighter, shifting from purple to brilliant white. The energy didn't hurt her. Instead, it felt warm and purposeful, like sunlight after a long winter. But the effect on the containment barriers was immediate and dramatic. Every barrier in the facility began to resonate in harmony, their quantum locks destabilizing as they tried to process an emotional frequency they weren't designed to handle. Alarms began blaring throughout the asteroid as thousands of cage doors sprang open. You've freed them all, Paraxis said with wonder, watching as creatures from dozens of worlds began emerging from their prisons. Every captive in this place. Well, Margaret said, I couldn't very well help just you and leave all those other poor souls locked up, could I? My conscience wouldn't stand for it. The Zephyrian leader was screaming orders into a communication device, but the response was chaotic babbling from throughout the facility. Freed prisoners were fighting back, security systems were failing, and something was very wrong with their prized weapon. Morthaxi, attack them, the leader commanded. Destroy the human and restore order! Paraxis looked down at the blue creatures who had been his captors for 3,000 years. They suddenly seemed very small and very fragile. My name, he said quietly, is Paraxis, and I think it's time you learned what a healthy dragon is capable of. He didn't breathe fire. That was a crude stereotype that had always annoyed him. Instead, he sang. The sound that emerged from his throat was like music made of starlight and growing things. It resonated through the asteroid's structure, not to destroy, but to change. Metal barriers became brittle and cracked. Security systems powered down as their circuits were overwhelmed by frequencies they couldn't process. Most importantly, every Zephyrian in the facility suddenly found themselves experiencing something they had never felt before. Genuine, overwhelming terror. What? What are you doing to us? The leader gasped, falling to his knees as waves of primal fear washed over him. Teaching you empathy, Margaret said matter-of-factly. Every bit of fear you've fed to others over the centuries, every moment of terror you've created, you're feeling it all at once. Consider it a learning experience. Throughout the facility, Zephyrian soldiers dropped their weapons and fled in panic as their former prisoners advanced. The aliens had spent so long as the ones inflicting fear that they had no idea how to function when they became the victims. But Margaret wasn't finished. She walked up to the cowering leader and knelt down so they were at eye level. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of every grandmother who had ever had to protect her family from monsters. Listen carefully, she said. You're going to take your people and leave this place. You're going to send word to every world you've conquered that your invasion is over. And you're going to find honest work that doesn't involve terrorizing innocent people. We cannot, the leader whimpered. Our entire civilization is built on conquest. We have no other way of life." "Then you'll learn one," Margaret said firmly. "The universe is full of opportunities for those willing to work honestly. Piraxis here knows quite a lot about different worlds and cultures. I'm sure he'd be happy to help you find a new path, provided you ask nicely and promise to behave yourselves." Piraxis nodded slowly. The idea of helping his former captors was strange, but it felt right in a way that revenge never could. "There are many worlds that would welcome traders and explorers," he said. "The Harmony systems always need skilled technicians. The Crystal Gardens could use builders who understand complex engineering." "But first," Margaret added, "you're going to help us clean up this mess. All these freed prisoners need to get home safely, and this facility needs to be turned into something useful instead of a house of horrors." Over the following weeks, the asteroid was transformed. Where once there had been prison cells, now there were gardens where ex-prisoners could recover before returning home. The torture chambers became workshops where Zephyrians worked alongside their former victims to build transport ships. The feeding arena was converted into a vast greenhouse where Piraxis could grow the foods he loved. Margaret found herself serving as a sort of universal grandmother, settling disputes, organizing work crews, and teaching basic conflict resolution to species who had never considered that problems could be solved without violence. Her no-nonsense approach to diplomacy proved remarkably effective. Few beings were willing to argue with someone who combined grandmotherly concern with the absolute authority of someone who had once made a space dragon reconsider his entire life. The Zephyrian leader, who finally introduced himself as Sub-Commander Zilf, proved surprisingly adaptable once the constant pressure to maintain dominance was removed. Under Margaret's guidance, he began reaching out to the worlds his people had conquered, offering reparations and assistance rather than demands for tribute. "This is highly irregular," he confided to Margaret one day as they watched former enemies working together to repair a damaged transport ship. "Our entire culture was based on the belief that only the strong survive, that compassion is weakness." "Strength without compassion is just brutality," Margaret replied, offering him a cup of tea made from some of Piraxis's special mushrooms. "And brutality always eats itself in the end. You can't build anything lasting on fear and pain." Piraxis, meanwhile, was rediscovering the joy of helping others. His natural abilities, once twisted to serve as instruments of torture, now flowered into tools of creation and healing. He helped ex-prisoners overcome their trauma, assisted in the design of new ships, and even began composing music that could heal psychological wounds. "I had forgotten," he told Margaret one evening as they watched the sunset through the asteroid's new observation dome, "what it felt like to use my abilities for something beautiful." "That's what happens when people try to make you into something you're not," Margaret said, settling comfortably against his warm scales. "But the real you is always there underneath, waiting for the right moment to emerge." As the rehabilitation project neared completion, delegations from across the galaxy began arriving to witness the impossible transformation. Word had spread quickly that the dreaded Zephyrian Empire had been changed overnight by a single human grandmother and a reformed dragon. Representatives from the Galactic Council, the Harmony systems, and even the notoriously suspicious Crystalline Collective came to see for themselves. They found former enemies working together, weapons being converted into tools, and an overall atmosphere of purposeful cooperation that seemed to defy everything they knew about interstellar relations. "How did you accomplish this?" asked the Council representative, a wise-looking being with feathered skin and 3 eyes. "Our best diplomats have failed to broker peace between far less hostile groups." Margaret smiled, the same gentle smile she used to use when her grandchildren asked her how she always knew just what to say. "It's simple, really. Most conflicts happen because people forget that everyone just wants to feel safe, valued, and understood. Once you address those needs, the fighting usually takes care of itself." The transformation wasn't complete, of course. There were still Zephyrians who clung to the old ways, still worlds that would need time to trust their former oppressors. But the foundation had been laid for something unprecedented, an empire built on cooperation rather than conquest. When the time came for Margaret to return to Earth, she was surprised to find herself reluctant to leave. The small community they had built on the asteroid felt like the neighborhood she had always dreamed of, diverse, purposeful, and filled with people who looked out for each other. "You could stay," Paraxis offered hopefully. "The universe has so much to offer, so many wonders to explore. I could show you the singing forests of Altair, the crystal caves of Proxima, the floating cities of the Horsehead Nebula." Margaret was tempted. After a lifetime of small adventures and local problems, the thought of seeing the cosmos was incredibly appealing. But she had responsibilities back home, and more importantly, she had learned something that the galaxy needed to hear. "Thank you, dear," she said, patting his massive snout affectionately. "But I think I'm needed back on Earth. If one grandmother can accidentally reform an galactic empire, imagine what we could accomplish if we put our minds to it." As her transport ship prepared for departure, Margaret looked back at the asteroid that had once been a monument to cruelty and was now a beacon of hope. Beings from dozens of species were working together, building something new and wonderful from the ruins of the old system. "Take care of yourself, Paraxis," she called out. "And remember, you're not just a dragon. You're a teacher, a healer, and a friend. Don't let anyone convince you to be less than that again." The great dragon's farewell song followed her ship all the way to the edge of the system, a melody that spoke of gratitude, hope, and the unshakable bond between a grandmother and the lost soul she had helped find his way home. Back on Earth, Margaret returned to her garden as if nothing had happened. But late at night, when the stars were bright and the world was quiet, she would sometimes hear distant music on the solar wind and smile, knowing that somewhere among those distant lights, an old friend was making the universe a little bit better, one song at a time. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the neighborhood bullies got too bold or the local politicians needed reminding about their responsibilities, people would swear they saw Margaret Thorne's eyes flash with starlight, and her voice would carry just a hint of that same authority that had once convinced an entire galactic empire to change its ways. After all, once you've successfully reformed a space dragon and toppled an interstellar dictatorship, dealing with earthly problems becomes surprisingly manageable.